Hello, my name is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director of the River Falls Public Library. I want to welcome all of you here tonight. I also want to set the stage for the format here. So we have a live audience here. We also have people viewing this virtually, either live or recorded. For those of you who are watching this virtually, we have just finished watching the 40-minute video called Bullied. It's a documentary about Jamie Nabozny, and I hope that for the viewers at home that you have watched that in full before you move on. So with that, I want to introduce to you Jamie. Jamie spent 5 years after the film came out, traveling the country, speaking and consulting on bullying and harassment in schools. He only stopped to start a family with his husband, Bo. They adopted 4 children through foster care and live in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Jamie now owns an American Family Insurance Agency and serves on the board of Children's Home Society, where he and his husband adopted their children. Please welcome Jamie.
Well, good evening. I will be honest, I'm probably a little rusty at speaking. I don't do this as often as I used to do. And I think quite a bit, unfortunately, has changed in the last 8 years since I stopped doing the speaking. And so I want to address some of that tonight as well, because I think it's important. So I want to start tonight by just talking about something that was kind of a universal experience for me when I did travel around the country. And one of the things that I was really grateful for as I traveled around was I wasn't in big cities when I traveled. I was really surprised by the places that invited me. I spent a lot of time in rural Minnesota and Wisconsin, probably because I'm from here and I've been in Minnesota most of my adult life. I spent a lot of time in rural New York, like upstate New York. I also, the only state that invited me to speak was the state of Wyoming. The Department of Health and Department of Education in Wyoming invited me. I actually was in schools in Alabama, of all places. So I had a lot of experience, and I also did some suburban and some inner city schools. And the experience was universal that I had as I spoke. I would ask several questions as I began to speak, and I'll repeat them now, and I'll tell you what the response was. I asked, how many people have heard either of the words fag or dyke in the last week? And most of the people raised their hands. I asked them how many of them have heard racial slurs in the last week. Most of them would raise their hands. I asked how many of them have heard derogatory terms for women or girls. Most of them would raise their hand. I asked how many of them in the audience saw those things on social media, and it was usually over 50% would raise their hands. And then I asked them the question, how many of them thought that every student in their school walked in the building every single year and felt safe and welcome? And not one hand would go up. And I would imagine that things are worse today, to be quite honest, because of the hostility that everyone is under. And so I want to start by that because I think it really sets the stage. And that wasn't that long ago that I was asking those questions. And so that I just want to set the stage for, I think, the environment, because in some ways things are worse than they were when I was in school. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, obviously my situation was extreme, but I think for a lot of people, they suffered in silence, but they also didn't have to face what kids face today with the onslaught and the barrage of negativity towards LGBT folks, towards people of different races, towards anyone who's different at this point. And so the first part of what I want to talk about tonight is something that I think if we did a lot more of this in this country, we would be a heck of a lot better off, and that's prevention. We seem to like to be crisis managers and deal with the major issues that come because we don't prevent things. But bullying and harassment is something that we absolutely can prevent. There's been a lot of studies showing how to do it. We just don't do a very good job in our country of doing that. And the first thing that I want to talk about, which I think is probably the basis of prevention, is teaching kids what world they live in and what world they will live in, and talking about the diversity of people that they will live with in that world, and talking about the fact that they're going to encounter a lot of people that are different than them, and then that's okay. That we're all here, we all got to live together, and we've all got to get along. And as crazy as simple as that sounds, that's very few schools are actually doing that. Um, the next thing that I think is equally important is teaching kids the skill of empathy. And a lot of people say, is empathy really a skill? And I say, yes, it is. I remember a lot of times, and I should mention, my mom is here. I know if you are watching online, you can't see that, but my mom is here with me tonight. My mom would often ask me the question, how do you think that would make somebody feel? How would you feel if that was you? And I don't think we do enough of that. We're so concerned about how each individual feels that we don't get outside of ourselves enough to think about that. There was a major study done in Canada on this very issue, and they had two elementary schools, and they followed them over the course of 5 years. And one of the schools had regular exercises on empathy, including watching Disney movies and asking about, how do you think a Disney character felt in this situation? Talking about in the classroom when there was an issue or an incident with students, how do you think that student felt? And another school who didn't do these activities. And by the fifth grade, there was an 80% reduction in bullying and harassment in the kids who went through the empathy exercises. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. This isn't, this can be done by anyone. And I think it's good parenting is what it is. It's good. It's if you're a good classroom teacher, this is the kind of things you do, especially with preschool or kindergarten, first and second grade, because not everybody is inclined to think about how others feel. Some people do it too much, right? But we can teach kids this. And we need to teach kids this, and it needs to be part of a comprehensive program to prevent bullying and harassment. The final thing that I want to say on the prevention piece, and I think this is incredibly important because I think it's missed all of the time when the issue of bullying and harassment is talked about. And that is that people are surprised, but I've said this before, I don't think we have a problem with homophobia in schools. We have a problem with sexism. The reality is that sexism is at the heart of homophobia. A lot of kids wouldn't get harassed if they were the captain of the football team and they were, acting like boys were supposed to act, doing all the things boys were supposed to act, and they came out. They would have a much better experience than the kid who is not acting like boys are supposed to act. And the same goes true with girls. And girls have more leeway until they cross a certain point. And one of the things that I would talk to a lot of young women about when I traveled the country was that they would end up playing sports, and they wanted to play sports with the guys because they didn't have girls teams or whatever. And they said that was totally okay until they played better than the boys. That's where the problem started. And I think that's exactly what sexism is about. And I think at the core of what we're experiencing right now with all of the anti-trans and any kind of gender norm stuff that we're experiencing is sexism. Really, that's what it's at the heart of it, because homophobia is definitely an issue, but at the heart of homophobia is sexism. And I also think the other part that's been lost probably in the last 15 years with the all of the social media that's out there is I think social media is a wonderful thing for a lot of reasons. It connects people that, if I had social media in Ashland when I was a kid, I would have loved to connect with other people who are young. I had a pen pal club that I found in the back of a magazine, and I actually had 3 gay pen pals around the country that I hoped were my age and, that sort of thing. But who knows? But that's what I had. And I would have loved to have had that. I would have loved to have been able to video chat with somebody from another state that I could connect with. And I didn't. But with that comes a lot of other negative things, including the harassment and bullying that happens. But what I think is missed in that conversation is what has happened to young women and girls. Because of the fact that traditionally, boys are much more physical. They also bully and they stop. And people can go home, and I had that advantage. I went home to a safe home where I could be myself, where I was comfortable, nobody was hurting me. But a lot of young women these days don't have that. The bullying that young women have always experienced is relentless. If they're a target for not just a day, but they're a target for weeks and sometimes years from other girls. And when you extend that beyond the school day and it never stops, and it's almost impossible for a young person to disconnect from social media. People say, just get off social media. There's so much that happens that they would miss if they did that. And I think it's one of the things that we're seeing is a huge increase in suicides of young women. And that's new. And there's been some studies that show that it's related, but I haven't seen a lot of direct studies that show it's a direct result of social media and bullying and harassment of young women and girls. And I experienced this as I traveled around the country. A lot of schools would invite me in because they had a rash of suicides from bullying. And a lot of times it was a rash of like 3 or 4 young women in a row that were killing themselves. So I think that that's the prevention piece that I think is really important, and the things that I think people need to be thinking about. The next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that we need a comprehensive approach to bullying. Right now, if bullying is addressed, when it's addressed, we treat it like a crime and punishment issue. The kid who's doing the bullying is punished. The other kid is sent back to class, and nobody wants to talk about what the aftermath or how to solve the problem. It's just, you committed the crime. Here's the punishment. We all go about on our way, and it doesn't work. I mean, clearly it's not working in our society. Our prisons are more full than almost any in the world because all we want to do is punish people. We don't want to help them. And I want to share with you a story of a young man that I met doing the speaking that I did that really drove this home for me, because I went out and I thought, I want to help these kids who are being bullied. I want to help save them. And I wasn't expecting this to happen. I was at a school in rural Ohio, outside of Akron, Ohio. And I finished my speech like I always did in front of students. And it's a very different speech that I give to students. And I asked for questions. I had a kid in the 4th row raise his hand. And I was a little nervous. This kid looked like the kids who bullied me in school, I'll be honest. So I'm looking like, please, anyone else raise their hand. And kids are terrified of being the first one to ask a question. So after awkwardly looking around, I finally had to call on this young man. And he stood up and he said, "Can I come up and give you a hug?" And this even made me more nervous, as you can imagine. So I'm standing there and I'm not going to say no. I mean, that would be rude. And so I'm a hugger. Sure, come on up and give me a hug. And people kind of laughed and giggled, and I didn't think too much about it. He came up, gave me a big bear hug, and sat back down. And I continued. And I really didn't think too much more about this. And I'm leaving the school that day in the parking lot. And the guidance counselor, who was one of the people that was involved in bringing me in, ran up to me and she says, "I need to talk to you before you leave." And I said, "Okay." She said, "You know that kid that hugged you at the beginning of the question and answer?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "He's one of the biggest bullies in the school." And she said, "I'm not sure if he was trying to make a joke of everything or what was going on there, but she said, I'm gonna follow up with him." And so, I left there, and I was probably 2 or 3 weeks later, I'm sitting at home and I got a phone call, and it was the same guidance counselor. And she said, "Jamie, I have a really weird request and I wanted to run it by you before I did anything." And I said, "Sure." And she said, "The mom of that kid that hugged you wants to call you." And I said, "Okay." "Do you know why she wants to talk to me?" And she said, "I don't know. She called here demanding to speak to you." And, I said, "I'm not going to give your information out, but if you are okay with it, I can pass that along." And I said, "Sure, give her my number. That's totally fine." It wasn't 5 minutes later that this woman called me. And she said, "I just wanted to thank you." I said, "Okay." She said, "My son came home from school the day that you spoke. And for the first time since I can remember, he came home and wanted to tell me about his day and was excited to talk about what you had said and what your message was." And she said, "Let me tell you about my son. My son was the kid who, up until 2nd grade, came home every day excited to learn, excited to be part of going to school, tell me about what he wanted to, and he was a very empathetic kid, cared about other people." And she said something changed in 2nd grade. And he started coming home and he started withdrawing and he was getting bullied in school. She said that changed in 5th grade when he became the bully. He started targeting other kids. And she said, and I could see in him, he was so angry, but I also could see that he was hurting. And she said, he came home from school that day and said, "Mom, I had no idea what I was doing and that I was hurting people so badly. And I feel really bad." And he also told his mom that he was gay. I get teary-eyed just thinking about it because I can't imagine what that was like for him to go through that. And my point is, if we don't treat the whole of this problem, we're failing half the kids in the equation, because we need to treat and help the kids who are being bullied. But if we leave the kids behind who are doing the bullying and don't get them the help they need, we're failing those kids as well. And that pattern doesn't end because they graduate school and leave. For so many of those kids, one of the kids that you see in the film, Roy Grandy, who was one of my biggest bullies in school, he grew up and ended up in abusive relationships, in and out of prison. And the saddest part for me was a message I got on social media after my film was shown at a school. A kid messaged me and said, "That was my stepdad until he went to prison, and he was still a big bully to me and my mom." So he didn't stop being a bully. He just found new people to bully. And that's because he wasn't helped when he was in school. If somebody said, "Why is Roy doing this? What is happening? What kind of help does Roy need? We might not be here today with Roy doing the things that he's doing. So the next thing that I want to talk about on the comprehensive approach is something that I hope we've learned, but every day I see something that tells me we haven't, and that's that we can't use a zero tolerance approach to bullying, just like we can't use a zero tolerance approach to drugs or anything else. It doesn't work. I remember not too long ago, I don't know why all these things happen in Wisconsin, but they do. It was probably 10 years ago now, but there was a young woman who got suspended from school because she gave one of her friends Midol, and that was distributing drugs in school, according to the school. And it's like, come on. We need to use some common sense, and we need to empower the people and train the people who are on the front lines of seeing what's going on. One of the things that I did when I would go out and speak in schools was I demanded that when I do an all staff training, that I meant all staff. I don't want to just see the teachers, and I don't want to just see the guidance counselors. I want the support staff there. I want the cafeteria workers there. I want the people that are helping in the halls, the crossing guards, because I can tell you right now, they're the ones that see most of the bullying, because they are not trained or told that they should respond to it. And kids know that. And so that was one of the things that I thought was really important in doing that. But I think when I think about this, you've got two situations, and I think this demonstrates the point really well with bullying. You've got two kids walking down the hall and they're buddies. And as a people that work in a school, they usually know who's friends, and they can also tell the relationship between them, and that somebody's joking. And when one of those kids calls the other one a fag, it needs to be addressed, and you need to do something and say something. But that is a very different situation when one of those same kids are walking down the hall and calling a kid who is effeminate, or for whatever reason, calling another kid a fag. You need to address that very differently. And if you don't, what you're doing is everything becomes kind of a joke, and it's not taken seriously. And I also think there's a teachable moment there. And one of the things that I've always encouraged teachers to do and staff members to do when I do trainings is to make it personal, because so often that doesn't happen. You're told as a professional, you just tell them the rule, you tell them they broke the rule, you need to go to the office, you're not okay. And one of the things I encourage people to do all the time, you see that kid walking down the hallway joking with his friend, calling his friend a fag, whatever the case may be. In that situation, walking up and saying, hey, what you just said is not okay. I've got a brother who's gay, and it's extremely offensive to me and a lot of people, and I'd really appreciate if you don't do it anymore. And that is so much more powerful for that kid to hear than punishing him because he knows that he's not supposed to say something. And that's very discouraged in a lot of schools from making it personal. And the same goes true with using terminology that's derogatory for women and girls, which is way too common in schools, that those words are extremely offensive. And I wish that people would come forward, and everyone knows a woman. Everyone is either a woman, they know a woman, and to say that term is really offensive. I've got moms and sisters, and I would never want them to hear that term. And a lot of times people go, whoa, because they don't think about those things. And I don't think a lot of times, I didn't really mean it. Well, no, you didn't. But that's why you have to let them know why it matters that they said it and that it's offensive to you. So now I want to get into the part that I don't get to talk about very much, but is, I think, on everybody's mind. And that's the onslaught of anti-LGBT laws that are happening around the country targeting LGBT folks. But I think there's a specific target, and that's towards trans and non-binary folks, due to the fact that it's an easy target and a target that a lot of people won't stand up for. And I think that is the travesty we're facing, because I think people aren't talking about gay marriage anymore, because almost 68% in the last polls of people support gay marriage. It's not a popular thing to talk about. But talk about banning trans kids from using the bathroom in school. Talk about any of the other laws that are being proposed. Talk about stopping drag shows for children. It's like, it blows my mind. But I also think that this is the last ditch attempt of a group of people in this country who are realizing that they're losing the war. And the sad part is, the people that are standing up are corporations. This is something I wouldn't have thought 20 years ago would happen, but you've got more corporations standing up and saying things and doing things than you have politicians. And I mean, I'm so grateful for Disney for standing up in Florida. I'm grateful. Target kind of did some interesting things, but they're trying to make it right. I mean, there's corporations are trying to figure this out, but they're a step ahead of a lot of politicians. And I think that there's a growing trend of other politicians who I want to think of as supportive staying quiet when this stuff is happening and not speaking out and saying something. Um, and I think one of the things that I see a parallel to is what happened after the civil rights legislation passed in the 1960s. There was a huge backlash, and a lot of people don't think about that. You go through history and you think, oh, civil rights, everything's fine. That wasn't the case. There was more lynchings that happened after the civil rights legislation passed. There was more opposition, especially in the South, but all over the country, towards African Americans. And I don't think people remember that part of the history. And I feel like we're living in that same time period. We now have a Supreme Court decision that says we can't be discriminated against in the workplace. We have a gay marriage decision that says we have the right to marry. And I think that the people who are upset about that they're trying to figure out, and they're very smart about this, how they can raise issues and target people. But the problem that I have, beyond the fact that it bothers me because I'm a gay man and I care about a lot of other people that are being targeted, they're going further than that. They're targeting anti-racism education. They're targeting education to help women and girls be empowered in schools. They're targeting anybody they can target because this is desperation. And that's honestly what it is. And I would like to say that, 10 years from now we'll be in a different place, but it really depends on what happens in the next 10 years. Because one of the things they're doing is they're convincing people who are not white, right-wing Christian folks to jump on the bandwagon. The reason the governor in Florida won by such a landslide last time is because he's got a lot of Hispanic people voting for him. They might change their mind after a lot of his stuff that he's doing right now on immigration and some other stuff, but he got them to vote for him. And so one of the things that this was something that I talked about when I would talk to educators, is I would tell them that you've got to make a stand. This is the point when it's not going to be the LGBT community, the people of color standing up, trans people standing up. It's going to take many more people. It's going to take allies to come forward and say, we are standing with you. Because it's power in those numbers. And it's going to take courage on people's parts to say stuff when they hear things. Whether it be at a gas station, whether it be at a grocery store, whether it be at a place of worship, all of us need to use our voices right now to say enough is enough. I'm not okay with that. And stand up for what's right. To vote for what's right. To march for what's right. One of the things that was happening in the last couple of years with the Black Lives Matter marches is not only did we have a lot of conversation with our 4 kids, but we went and marched. We went and spent time where George Floyd was killed, because it's really important for me that my kids understand why these things are happening and what our part is to play in them, which is to stand up. It might not be about me, but it's about all of us. And the power of that is huge. And I really wish that there would be some kind of a joint statement from every organization in this country, from the NAACP to the to Human Rights Campaign to the National, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. There's so many different organizations that need to stand up and say enough is enough. We are not going to stand for this. It doesn't matter if you're attacking one of us, you're attacking all of us. Put out ads, do whatever it takes, because it takes that kind of a coordinated effort and all of us doing our individual part to make sure that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we have a very different country where everyone feels safe and welcome. I noticed on the way into town that says River Falls, a place where all are welcome. That's not something that I feel everywhere. And I'll be honest with you, me and my husband I got transferred to North Dakota, of all places, in 2009 for when I was working at Wells Fargo, and I was terrified to go up there. And when I got up there, I couldn't have felt more welcome, and I never, ever felt uncomfortable living there or like we weren't welcome. And now I travel places, and I feel very different. And whether that's about me or what's actually happening, it tells me that the climate has changed. And instead of feeling like I can go anywhere and be myself, I'm feeling like I'm on the defense. And that needs to change. It is not okay. The fact that we're going backwards on so many issues scares me, It scares me. I have 4 kids of color that I'm now raising. It scares me for them. I'm actually a very big minority in my household. Um, my 4 kids are all kids of color. My husband's Hispanic. Luckily, my parents moved in, so I'm not so outnumbered. But because they're always saying, "You don't understand because you're white." So there you have it. And it might be about what we're having for dinner, but that's just the way that it is. But in all seriousness, I want a world that they can grow up and be proud of who they are, be safe in who they are, and also be proud of the family they came from, right? Because that's where we're at. And I'll end with that. But the final thing I just wanted to say, which is something that really bothers me, is the hypocrisy that nobody's talking about with what's happening around the country. So you've got 2 different things happening at once, and that seem completely opposite. So there's a lot of people saying they're concerned about our children and concerned about what's happening to our children. And so we need to take the rights of parents away to let kids have counseling and go through hormone therapy that are transgender, because the parents don't really know, and we need to step in and stop that. And then you've got those same people saying we need to empower parents, so that we've got to take away the ability to have drag shows for children, because parents don't know and they can't go do that. They can't take their kids to that. We need to ban books, and we need parents to have this authority. Well, it's either one way or the other. Parents need to have the power to decide what their kids are going to do, or they don't. But it's like a lot of things, it's hypocrisy, because they want to make the rules based on what they believe. And the other part of this, and this is somewhat controversial, but there's a lot of people that believe, including a lot of the same people who are opposing my rights, to believe that I was born this way. Well, what people are not born with is hatred and bigotry. People are not born as a certain religion. Nobody's born and get separated from their family, but they still become fully Lutheran. It just doesn't happen. People are taught these things. And I'm glad to see that there are some people that are standing up. It's very few people on the right side of things that are standing up and saying enough is enough, or standing up and saying this isn't okay. But not enough people are doing that. But I think we also need to start calling out the hypocrisy of this stuff, taking off, Florida and other states are now trying it too, taking out diversity education, taking out advanced placement courses on African-American history, because it talks about, of all things, that Black people have been oppressed and that white people did it. It's like, well, yeah, that's how it was, talking about white privilege, that it just doesn't exist anymore because we had a Black president. Well, that's not exactly true, and everybody knows it, except for these people who are saying they want to rewrite history and saying it's not a big deal anymore. But I can't not address the hypocrisy of what's happening, because it seems every time I hear it's about parents' rights or it's about not parents' rights. Well, which is it? Because we can't have both. And it just drives me crazy, because there are kids that are being harmed in this country, and there are kids that will not be here and that will not graduate high school because of what's happening. And that's where the real problem lies. In 10 years from now, we might be in a better place, but for some people, they won't make it. And that's why we need to fight like hell to make sure that they do. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. And could I get a glass of water? Yeah.
I just want to make sure that you're
Oh.
loud enough that the people in the virtual world can hear you. And then if they don't speak very loud, if you could repeat the question.
I can do that, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I just want to thank you for being here tonight and sharing your experience and your wisdom.
Thank you so much.
With all of us. I do like what you're saying about empathy resonates with me, because that's something that I talk about in my home, and anybody who knows me knows I talk about that as one of the missing components in all of this. Where and part of the like the difference between punitive and restorative justice.
That's exactly, yeah.
And conflict resolution is also, that's how you can, in a educational setting, having that model where you're having to go through that process creates that empathy, and the punitive just perpetuates the issue, right? Like,
yeah.
You're being punished, and so then you blame the person, you blame the victim if you're the bully, right?
Yep.
But if you're in this restorative space where you have to interact with one another, I use the phrasing of you don't have to be my friend, but you do have to respect my humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something our children went to the Montessori here, and that they have that as their conflict resolution from 4K through 6th grade, where they have to walk the peace path with their with the person that they've had a disagreement with,
Yeah.
and they have to talk about it, and that's how you develop empathy,
Yeah.
and compassion, and a recognition of someone else's humanity, and having that process, developing that connection makes it significantly harder than to do harm for that person when you can view them as
Yeah.
a human being with feelings and knowing that the outcome that you cause is pain, right?
And that's exactly it. The restorative justice part is key, because one of the things that I also hear a lot of is that when these things happen, there's never any opportunity for the two people to sit down and have a conversation. And to me, it's one of the most basic things. And I tell parents all the time that reach out to me, reach out to those other parents and have a conversation. Because parent to parent, they're going to have a reaction to the fact that all you're trying to do is make sure your kid is safe. And not all parents will respond well to that. I know that. But for the most part, most people are not sociopaths, and they will see your humanity, but they can't see it if you don't sit down and talk about it. And they're only hearing one side of the story. And a lot of times it takes, I know this from being a parent, it takes sitting down and hearing the other side of the story to get the whole picture, because we don't get the whole picture always from our kids. There's always a filter. But I think, there's one of the best schools that I ever visited. I was surprised that questions that I asked at the beginning of all of my school assemblies, I had hardly anybody in the entire, and I thought, did they tell the kids not to raise their hands? And what I ended up finding out, this was a school in rural Wyoming, and they have restorative justice at the heart of everything they do. And do you know who controls that? The students. Because if we ask for the adults to become the judge and the jury of the restorative justice process, it doesn't go as well. You want to build a culture where it's built in, and the teachers can sit back and watch the kids take this on. The kids call somebody a name, another kid steps in, it's over with. And all of a sudden it becomes part of the culture that this isn't okay. And it's built from the ground up with the kids being in charge of it. And I was blown away by that. But that's something we don't do enough of as adults. There's some great restorative justice programs being tried out. Philadelphia has one of the best in the country that blows me away at what they do, even with victims of violent crime, because somebody said you can't do it with victims of violent crime. And I've seen this work. I've heard from people in Philadelphia that said it was so powerful for me as the victim of a violent crime to sit across from the person who did this and be able to tell them what my life has been like since this happened to me. And people literally start crying, and it changes hearts and minds instead of just punishing and making that person more angry and bitter towards the world.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have that opportunity as the perpetrator of a
Yeah.
crime, the only person that you can take into consideration from your cell is yourself, and then you just stew in your own, hatred.
Yep.
I know kids who are significantly more emotionally intelligent than adults that have, because of that process. It's fascinating to watch, and to have it modeled for you is, that's how it works.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Also, thank you for being here. It's very inspirational to have you here personally, to hear your story.
Thanks.
I'm a strong advocate for all the things you're talking about. One of the struggles I have is continuing, especially as you alluded to in the world today, where it feels like we've gone backwards now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an old white guy. I sort of feel like I'm of the generation to blame for that.
Yeah.
Maybe not me personally, but my generation. And it's very discouraging. And I guess my question to you is, what do you draw on to keep fighting the good fight?
I think I have to believe that eventually things will get better. I have to believe that historically things keep progressing, but there's always backlash. When you think about any historical movement, you think about even the women's rights movement, the right to vote, all of that had a huge backlash, and things went backwards before they went forwards. And I think we're in that same time period, but I think it's worse because people have found their voice. People of color have found their voice in our country. Women have found their voice. LGBT people have found their voice. And we're not going anywhere. We're not backing down. And this scares the crap out of people. And they're going to do whatever they can to stop this. It's not going to work, and I don't think, I think that there's a religious component to it, but I think that's not what religion is supposed to be doing. And I think they're using that as a guise for their racism, for their sexism, for their homophobia. And we just need to keep plugging away and know that we're on the right side of history. When history is written and we look back at this time, I think this will be a shameful period in our country's history. And people will be shocked, just like I was shocked reading in school about the fact that kids couldn't go to school with kids of other races. I mean, I remember reading this thinking, what? How is this possible? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And I think people will look back and say, what do you mean trans kids couldn't use the bathroom that they want to use? That's insane. I have to believe that that day will come, because otherwise, what is it worth fighting for? So, and just knowing that we're right and that other people depend on us. And I think it's the same thing as a old white man myself. I have a responsibility to speak up and talk about my privilege, something I didn't know about until I was a social worker in Minneapolis. I started my career as a social worker, fell into banking, then did public speaking, consulting, then went back into banking, and now I'm an insurance agent. It doesn't make any sense, I know, but it's my journey. But one of the things I remember was I grew up in northern Wisconsin in a very poor town. My parents were very poor. I thought, I don't have any privilege. What are they talking about? Like I always, people weren't using the term privilege, but people were saying, oh, well, you don't understand because you're white. I heard that all the time from the kids that I was working with. I was working with inner city homeless kids. And I remember one of my social worker, my coworkers asking me, she said, I want you to do something. And I was like, okay. She said, I want you to take your kid out that's looking for an apartment. Have him walk in that building and ask if there's apartments available. And then I want you to go back the next day and ask the same question. I said, well, yeah, I could do that. And I would go back and they'd tell him that they didn't have any apartments available. I'd walk in and they'd say they have 3. I also remember being 17 and being homeless and how everybody wanted to bend over backwards to help the poor white kid get ahead because clearly he didn't do anything to deserve this. And then I'd watch my kids that I was working with apply for 40 jobs and not get a call back. And I learned firsthand what white privilege was. And I still benefit from white privilege. And it's important that I acknowledge that. It's important that I talk about it. It's important that my kids understand that. So, go ahead.
I was going to ask about, in Ashland, clearly the principals set the tone. And then for everyone in the school, how can we go about exert some impact on them that are at the top that are so resistant and have lots of excuses?
It's hard. Threats of lawsuit work. My case established that administrators are responsible when they don't do their job. And it's not just that the school is responsible, they're individually responsible. Administrators now have to have insurance like a doctor or a dentist the same way, because if they get sued individually, the school's not covering them. That's what my case established. And that's a pretty big thing. The other thing I will say, if we really want to change schools, we have to do exactly what we were just talking about, is empower the young people to change the school. And they are. Young people are leading by example all over this country. There's a lot of resistance to that, but they're doing it. And Ashland hasn't changed all that much. I wish I could say that it has. I have a niece who's recently come out as a lesbian and is getting bullied. And I'm now having to work with, she's a step niece, so her dad is not my brother. Her dad is somebody else, but I'm working with him on working with the school. Ashland just fired a teacher, a straight teacher, who was running the GSA and was trying to do his best to be supportive of students, and they let him go. Well, guess what happened the next day? 150 people showed up at the school and demanded they rehire him. And guess what? They did. We need to do that kind of stuff. We can't just stand by and say it's okay anymore. We need to stand up and do. And I was shocked because I didn't think they'd rehire him, but they did. And, I know a lot of the LGBT students, they think he's one of the few people sometimes that supports him. But there's 3 out staff members in the school now. I mean, that wasn't the case when I was there. There's a lot that has changed. But again, it's asserting that power when the time comes, because they let him go because parents were complaining that he was talking about LGBT rights in class. Yeah. Yeah.
That's, leading by example, right? Like that.
Yep.
The kids are doing it. Like the responsibility of shouldering the burden for the future is theirs, and they know it.
Yep. Well, and they have to lead on things like climate change because we're not. They have to lead on things like human rights, because oftentimes we're not. And so, that's part of what keeps me going too. Is I mean, it shouldn't be on them to show us the way. We need to be working towards that as well.
My dad used to say, "Don't protest too much," and I was very sensitive to some of the thoughts you had about the people that maybe do the bullying,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe actually it's because they are fearful of consequence for themselves.
Yeah.
How do we help those people?
I think one of the things that we need to do, the comprehensive approach that I'm talking about is the restorative justice part, but it's also figuring out what's going on with that student, because not every student that bullies is gay, but there's something going on. Bullying comes from insecurity. I don't feel very good about myself, so I want to put others down. Where does that come from? What's happening? I can tell you right now, most of those kids are being hurt by parents. They were bullied when they were younger. There's something that's caused this, and they're acting out in that way. And trying to figure out and help them, having compassion for them, as well as saying what they're doing is not okay. I think all of it's important. And I think that, like I said, so often we just don't do any of that. We just punish them and think everything's going to work itself out. And those are the same kids that grow up and abuse their people that they date. They abuse their children. They're bullies in the workplace because we're not helping them. But there's a lot that we can do. And the restorative justice part, to me, is one of the biggest things. I'm blown away by a lot of the amazing stories that have happened. I had one guy, and this was one of the Philadelphia ones that happened. He was a 19-year-old kid who got gay bashed by 3 other young men. I mean, so badly he was in the hospital and almost died. And he had to volunteer to be part of the restorative justice program. Only one of his attackers chose to be part of that. And because they were young, they asked if their parents would also participate in this, because one of the young man ended up having to live back with his parents. He was in college and he moved back home to recover from his injuries, that sort of thing. And his parents and the other parents agreed, and they spent 6 months doing, like, I don't know how often they got together. But it changed so much so that when I got the message, it was from the bully, from the attacker in the situation, who sent me a message and said that he'd seen my film and wanted to tell his own story. And he had just gotten married, and his best man was this other kid that he had gay bashed. And he said, I had no idea. I mean, he's like, I just was clueless, and having to sit there and listen to his mom talk about the call that she got when she thought her son was going to die in the hospital before she got there. And watching his own mom in horror respond to that and realized, oh my God, look what I did. Like, without that, if you just put that kid in prison, like you said, he's just going to get more angry, blame gay people for putting him in prison. It wouldn't have done any good. But that program, not only, it changed his life. I mean, he's a huge, supporter of LGBT rights. He stands up. And this best friend is a gay man. He said one of the big things that they developed was this love of video games. Both of them love video games. And this was kind of the common thing that they learned about each other. Well, they started playing and they kept playing together, and it developed into a friendship. But that's what restorative justice can do. And it also doesn't take the power away from the victim. A lot of people think that. To me, it empowers them. If I can sit across, I would love to have been able to sit across from these kids who did this to me and tell them what effect it had on me. That's powerful. And to be able to hear, from them an apology, and a sincere apology. Because often we make kids apologize and they don't mean it. And I could tell you from the other side of that, it doesn't mean anything for the kid receiving the apology. My kids do this. Apologize to your brother. I'm sorry. Like, well, they don't mean it, and it doesn't mean anything, So, yeah.
Is your film on any other media?
Yes. The film can be seen on Vimeo, and it can also be seen on YouTube. And it's a slightly shorter version than the one that you saw tonight on DVD. It's also available for free from tolerance.org. They will send it out with an education kit to anyone using it for educational purposes. So if it's for a school, a church, a library, anything, they'll send it out.
I would just love to send it to the superintendent and principals,
Yeah.
It's just, just a reminder, we're here.
Yeah.
And it's because we know in the schools around us, in this rural area,
Yeah.
we know kids are being told that same message. Well, if you weren't so gay.
Yeah.
And this is your problem. So you need to find another school to go to, because we're not going to change.
Yeah.
And that's just.
And one of the things that I talk about, and I'll talk about here, because I think some of you in this room are helping and advocating for these kids that are in these schools, is one of the things that changes the conversation really quickly is stop using the term bullying. Start using the terms sexual harassment. If somebody is being harassed because of their sexual orientation, they're being sexually harassed. If somebody is physically touched in a sexual way, that's sexual assault. If somebody is assaulted physically, that's an assault. Those are legal and they're criminal. And when you use that terminology, it changes the way that schools respond. Because all of a sudden schools are like, wait a minute, these are things that I could get in big trouble for. Bullying has become, it means anything. I'm teasing you because you wore a green shirt today to, it's such a broad term and it's just not taken seriously anymore. But using that terminology and helping parents use that, that's what I just did with my niece's dad, was talk to her about, I said, when you describe the incidents that she's went through, one of the things that she was groped. And I said, that's a sexual assault. You write that in there as she was sexually assaulted by this student on this day, and I reported it and nothing was done. Boom. All of a sudden, they're going to pay attention. And I also said, do not communicate verbally. Communicate via email so there's a record, and ask them to respond in an email. That changes things. I also told him to copy me on the email so he could see my name. I hope that will also change things, because I think that sometimes they just need to know. And then at the end of it, say, the only thing I want is for my daughter to be safe. And if you don't do that, I will have to take further action. You don't have to say what that action is. You just have to say you will. And they're going to be scared. And I don't care why kids get protected. Just protect the kids. If it's because you're afraid of being sued or because you're a good person and you want to do the right thing, I don't care why you do it. Just do the right thing. But those are some of the things that that I usually talk to parents or teachers about, because teachers are often in the middle of this too and wanting to help students, but they're not heard. They're not getting anywhere. I had teachers who did the same thing. My guidance counselor was an amazing advocate who was ignored completely. So
how would you handle that in an instance of, like, you're talking about the implications of social media and how that changes the continuous nature of bullying? Like, what's a good way to address that?
a lot of times it's a similar thing, but I always tell parents to threaten legal action, because when it's documented, and I try to encourage parents to get it documented, because with a lot of social media, things disappear and it's hard to do that. But try to do whatever you can to document it. And even if it's just keeping a journal of what's been happening. And then the first thing I encourage them to do is talk to the parents of the kid that's doing it. And it's usually, a lot of times it's one kid, but sometimes there's more than one. And then after that, I would say go to the police, because what's happening is criminal. And that's what people forget. I mean, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't be different when you're 15 than when you're 25. Like, think about any of these things happening in a workplace. Like, I think about when I worked at Wells Fargo. If anyone had dared call me a name, they would have been fired, and I probably would have been promoted because they were afraid I was going to sue them. Because workplaces, you'd never tolerate that. But somehow we think that 15-year-olds should be able to handle that. But 25-year-olds can't. That makes no sense. And so, but using the terminology that's criminal, but also and if you go to the police department and say, I want to press charges, and then they say no, everybody has a boss. And that is the other thing. I mean, and I had one family, I said, you need to start putting this out on social media and saying what the school isn't doing and what's happening to your child. Within 3 days, they had a meeting with the superintendent and things changed really quickly because the school was embarrassed. Again, don't care why they protect the kid, just protect the kid. So.
I think you touched on something really interesting right there when you were comparing the workplace where we've got all adults versus the school where we have adults in charge and children.
Well, let's start with
Yeah.
adults is a relative term.
Yeah.
Know, and I think that's what goes back to.
But I think that we think of it differently, and the fact that we think of it differently allows these things to continue and to perpetuate, when we would never, ever put up with that in the workplace. But we don't use the same terminology. If my boss asked me out and I said no, and then they demoted me or fired me, it's a very obvious situation. Like you know what that is, and everybody wouldn't tolerate that. If my coworker was harassing me because I was gay in both Minnesota and Wisconsin, I could report that and they could lose their job and I could sue because of that if they didn't deal with it. But yet we have those same laws in schools. We just don't talk about them in the same way, and we don't use that terminology to help advocate for students. And that's one of the things that we need to start doing, because it should be enough to say, this is what's happening and it's wrong and you need to stop it. And unfortunately, it's not. And so often, I will say this, a lot of the kids who are doing this have wealthy and powerful parents. And the parents, a lot of the parents who have a lot of power are the loudest parents. And sometimes those are the parents who disagree with certain students being in the school in the first place. And that's a very difficult situation because sometimes even the administrators feel like their hands are tied because, the kids are harassing one of the parents or on the school board. I had a situation like that. And how do we deal with that? I said, you write a letter to the state because the state oversees that school district, and let them know what's happening and that things are not changing. Things change very quickly. And, that was one of the things that unfortunately my parents didn't know, that everybody had a boss, that you can go to the superintendent was the boss of the principal. There was a school board above that. And that sometimes is it works because you get somebody who's finally going to say, we have some liability here. There's some issues here. Or you get somebody who really gives a crap and does something about it. I mean, I've seen that situation with the school board where there was 3 school board members who got super upset about a situation, and they passed all kinds of resolutions and they said, we're going to change our culture. They weren't even aware that there was a problem, but when they became aware, they wanted to do the right thing. And sometimes that's all it takes, is somebody who wants to do the right thing in a position of power. So, yeah.
Really appreciate everything you've shared. I know you mentioned your career path is then that you're not doing this as much anymore.
Yeah.
What circumstances could change so that you would start doing it?
So the big reason I stopped doing the speaking was because we started the adoption process, and I was on the road 8 to 9 months of the year. And sometimes I didn't come home during the weekends because there was suicide prevention walks. There was, a screening of my film on a Saturday night. And my husband said right out, I'm not going to be a single parent. I can't do that. And so that was a big part of it. And now I started my own business because in 2020, 3 of our 4 kids were failing school. And my husband was working from home on meeting after meeting after meeting, getting interrupted nonstop with kids not being able to work technology and not knowing how to do things. And so we made the decision for me to stay home. And when I decided to go back, the idea of working at another bank didn't appeal to me, and being my own boss did. And I actually love being an insurance agent because when I started banking, I had a lot of customer interaction. And then the further I went up the chain, I was, my last position, I was in charge of retail banking, mortgage banking, and civic banking. And I didn't see a lot of customers anymore. And I missed that. And I love being an insurance agent, helping people, sitting down with clients. On the way here, I actually stopped in Hudson. I have a client there, spent an hour with him. My mom had to sit in the car, but they didn't have air conditioning in their house. It broke. So she was better off in the car. Believe me, I was like a little worried about coming here after sweating for an hour. But I love that interaction. I love being able to help people. Next week, I've got an 86-year-old woman who's, she said, I can't leave my house, but I said, I can come to you. And she was so thrilled because, not a lot of people make house calls anymore, but I love that. And I think that this is, I foresee myself doing this for a while. I can't imagine that, I don't know what would have to change, but as long as I have the kids, I get to go to their baseball games and to their wrestling matches and to their lacrosse matches and to their choir concerts, and I'm never away. And that's what's important to me right now. So. All right. So yeah, no problem. And I'll stick around afterwards. I think the library's closed, but if we can, maybe I'll be around outside if people want to talk or whatever. So.
So thank you, Jamie. I also want to give a nod to his mom. You did such a nice job. Yeah. What was that? Oh, that's what I was thinking also. I raised 2 boys, and how much I learned from them. I mean, it just opens our lives in ways that we never would have imagined. And yeah. I also would like to identify that we have PFLAG here in the audience. Is there anything that you would like anybody to know about PFLAG? Do you believe that parents know how to reach you if they needed support? Do you think there's enough knowledge out there that people would know who to reach? Please, if anybody from PFLAG wants to come up here and speak. And no, okay. Okay.
Have a stationary booth. We are available on Facebook and Twitter.
Okay, let me just repeat this. You're going to be at the River Falls Days and have a booth there. You're also on Facebook and Twitter. Instagram.
And we are, meet here at the library
You meet here at the library
every fourth Thursday at 6.
every fourth Thursday at 6. And it's so confidential that I didn't even know that.
Well, we try to be confidential
Yes.
in those meetings. Or you can reach out on Facebook, and one of our people will contact you if you are more hesitant or want more privacy.
Okay, so she's saying that if anybody wants more privacy and would like to reach out through Facebook or those other forms of social media, that they're happy to, find that way to reach out to you. So, in summary, I want to thank you for being here, for the audience for being here, for those who tuned in. I am working on changing the library's behavior policy in order to make it really clear how we feel about these things and where we stand. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.